Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. There are now about 20,000 civil lawsuits filed against chemical company giant Monsanto over Roundup, its mega weed-killing product that is so widely used across the country. My guest today is the lawyer who won the first big verdict against Monsanto for Roundup, a nearly $300 million verdict on behalf of a client who had developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a blood cancer from use of Roundup. Tim Litzenburg from Richmond, Virginia. A fascinating conversation about the development of these cases that are now proceeding in courtrooms across the country and the difficult issues of proving the scientific link between Roundup, its key ingredients, as well as the product itself as a whole, and cancer. Tim has a very front row view of these cases, having won the first case against Monsanto. A great conversation as we go inside a major mass tort case involving one of the big corporate giants in our country. Stay tuned for a great conversation about Monsanto. On today's episode of Good Law, Bad Law, we're going to be talking about Monsanto and the trials that we are hearing a lot about involving Monsanto's billion-dollar baby, as they call it, Roundup. And my guest is Tim Litzenburg, an attorney from Richmond, Virginia, who won the very first verdict in these Roundup cases against Monsanto, a $280 million verdict on behalf of his client late last year. So first of all, Tim, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.
This is really an extraordinary story involving Roundup, and there's so many different aspects of this case that I think everybody ought to be very not only interested in but deeply concerned about. I was talking about this with my wife just this morning, and the question was, how is it that Roundup hasn't been banned already, knowing what we now know about this very popular and widely used weed killer? But you're going to help us understand that. But first of all, give us a little bit of background on yourself, who you are, and then we'll get into this fantastic verdict that you achieved against Monsanto.
Sure. So I graduated from law school about 10 years ago, and did medical malpractice, personal injury law, and both sides, and a couple different jobs. And in 2012, I answered an ad, a mysterious Craigslist ad that said a unique opportunity to do high-level work, which I always said would be the name of my autobiography. And it was for a little firm in Orange, Virginia, which is sort of in the middle of nowhere. And I thought, how could they be doing high-level work there? But it was a mass tort plaintiff side job. Mass torts are is just a term of art for suing manufacturers of products, mass-marketed products that cause injuries or disease. And so it's sort of akin to mass production in that you are, you design a case, you design a litigation, and then you can do a whole bunch of trials or whatever with the same sort of formula. So it's the only way you could conceivably. I mean, we have 500 cases, Roundup cases alone, I think, at our firm. We have 3 lawyers. It's the only way you can really do that. But you get great economies of scale there, and it really makes it worthwhile to put a whole lot of time and effort into battling the company. So I spent some years doing most of that field of law has tended to be against the manufacturers of pharmaceuticals and medical devices. So I did that for several years, did a number of pharmaceutical trials across the country, and for the big drug litigation that settled, and then I was sort of looking for the next thing to do. And I had always thought, Monsanto is sort of a bad word in America, and with good reason. Not a lot of people are real fond of Monsanto. The sort of cringe when they hear it, even if they don't entirely know why. And I'd always thought, well, that they've made a lot of bad products in the past, PCB, Agent Orange, DDT, and I always thought, if you could give American juries an opportunity to, vote for or against Monsanto and fill in a blank for an injured person, I have a feeling you're going to do the right thing more often than not, and you're not going to have the defense that pharmaceutical companies have, which is, we're trying to help people. It's a hard thing for a chemical company to say. So I've been looking at Monsanto pretty closely, 2014 going into 2015. And actually what I was trying to do was they cast themselves as an agricultural company now. In fact, they have this hilarious line that they say, we unfortunately share the name with a chemical company, that's made some toxic products in the past. Of course, it's the same company. They just don't want to.
Right, that's not a coincidence.
They don't want their past remembered too closely.
Yeah.
But they did in the 90s shift pretty heavily towards agriculture, and Roundup is a big part of that. So they've developed this product, Roundup, which is the active ingredient is glyphosate. And at first it was sort of a marginal herbicide. You could spray it on targeted weeds and it would kill them. And it was pretty effective at killing them, but it would kill anything. So in the 90s, Monsanto started inventing and patenting genetically modified seeds. And that has become their bread and butter, but just as much Roundup, because what they've done is created a number of seed lines that are called Roundup Ready. And so these are seeds that are genetically modified to withstand Roundup treatment. And so now you can take Roundup and spray it all over your fields, and it will kill every living thing there except for the things that Monsanto has genetically engineered to withstand it. So now it's suddenly become something we can sell, thousands of gallons to farmers for. So both the seed business and the Roundup business are intertwined, and they picked up hugely in the 90s, and Monsanto sort of shifted their direction there. What I was looking at was some countries around the world, of course, do not allow genetically modified products, and China being a famous example. And China is such a big company that affects the global market. Country that affects the global market.
It might be a company too.
Yeah. And so what was happening was that I was thinking that alfalfa hay, actually, that people were trying to grow organic or at least non-GMO alfalfa hay, and people were growing Monsanto alfalfa in an adjacent field or a field down the road, and they would cross-pollinate, and so you'd start getting some of the genetics of the GMO crop being included in your fields, whether or not you had any intention to grow GMO hay. And so what was happening was people were shipping what they thought was non-GMO hay to China, and China would test it, and China was rejecting some of the shipments, which, surprised the farmers who grew it, saying, this is, GMO genes in it. And that caused if I recall correctly, a 15 to 20% hit in the global price of hay, since it's a commodity. So I was actually looking at potentially like a consumer class action or a producer class action, I suppose, of people who had lost money in the hay market because of the spread of Monsanto's genetics sort of throughout the air. And I was looking
Tim,
at that. Go ahead.
Didn't Monsanto also bring lawsuits against some of those downwind farmers, even though those farmers? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Monsanto. That's another sort of evil thing that they've done, and it's interesting. They'll deny it and say that's just an urban legend, but it's absolutely true. I'm not sure what basis they deny it. They do sue farmers for reusing their seeds. What you have to, if you, for thousands of years, when you are a farmer, you harvest your crop and you set aside a certain portion of it as seeds for the next year, plant for the next year. When you're growing Monsanto crops, you have signed a contract where you have to destroy all the seeds so that you have to buy new ones next year from Monsanto. Otherwise, they would only have to sell you, a lot of seeds one time. And if Monsanto suspects and finds that a farmer is saving his seeds and planting them, they will sue them for IP infringement. And
Intellectual
that has
property.
extended,
Yeah.
and that has extended, I believe, into some farmers that were unintentionally growing it. Monsanto saying you're essentially stealing our intellectual property. You never paid us for these seeds, and you're benefiting from their genes. I'm not intimately familiar with any of those lawsuits, but I understand that to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead. So how did that lead to these Roundup cases then?
Yeah, I was looking at that in early 2015 and trying to get that going. And I'm not a class action lawyer, although the two are somewhat related. Less towards it's distinct in that it's everybody's got an individual case. You can't be part of a class without knowing it. Things can't be settled on your behalf without your consent, etc. You have your right to an individual trial, and it makes sense because these are injuries. They're specifically cancer. Nobody's cancer is the exact same as anybody else's. And so while I was trying to get the Hay thing going, I was, had a Google alert from Monsanto or something, and one morning, March 15th, 2015, or March 20th, 2015, I woke up and the World Health Organization has a subcomponent called IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And I was familiar with them because one of the big drug litigations I'd done concerned a drug that they had declared as a probable human carcinogen. And so they announced on that day they'd been studying glyphosate and Roundup and declared that to be in the same category, a probable human carcinogen. That was big news because there were some scientific papers pointing to that, but the EPA had, and interestingly, as of today, still has been totally consistent that they don't think it causes cancer, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but it's, not a very conservative approach. If you think about an organization that has protection in its name, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that this may cause cancer, you'd think that something called the EPA would want consumers warned about that possibility, but they've consistently said, "Oh, we don't think it causes cancer," which is crazy. And again, I'm sure we'll talk about later. So that was big news, and the World Health Organization does not have a dog in the fight. When they say something causes cancer, it generally causes cancer. And they've done a comprehensive study with all independent scientists looking at peer-reviewed published literature, and then they published, monographs hundreds of pages long about their conclusions. So at that point, I sort of got the go-ahead from my law firm and started engaging experts and started collecting cases. We didn't advertise on TV. I think we made known that we were pursuing this on the internet, something like that. And then it sort of grows organically. Referral lawyers start picking up on it. People start going to their local lawyers, and they'll send cases to specialists like us. And soon we were getting in a whole bunch of cases, and I filed some of the first cases around the country against Monsanto, and within a few months, pretty much became a full-time Roundup lawyer.
So I want to get to the story of the Johnson case, the one that became the first verdict against Monsanto for Roundup. But you mentioned this, and I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, which was IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And I've had dealings with IARC too. I had a big mini mass tort involving brain cancers and vinyl chloride against Dow Chemical, and so I had some dealings with IARC, and it's you talked about IARC as compared to the EPA, and one of the things about the EPA that's always struck me is that in this country we let big companies have a huge influence over regulations. We let drug companies or former drug company executives have a big role in FDA regulations, for example. And former chemical company executives have had a lot to do with what goes on or what doesn't go on at the EPA. But IARC is different in that it's an international organization and based in Europe, I believe, right? So they're not, they don't have the same culture of being so in bed with industry that we know is the case when it comes to the EPA in this country.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You used to seeing this. I was used to seeing this revolving door kind of coziness between FDA and the drug companies. But I'll tell you, the EPA chemical company link is even worse. And I don't think as many people are watching it or are as aware of it. You've got Scott Pruitt in there right now, the wolf guard in the hen house. And it's the folks that are regulating the chemicals are amazingly friendly with the companies that make them. And of course, just objectively, one big difference is, people think that the EPA or the FDA tests these compounds, and that's absolutely not true. They don't do any testing whatsoever. They ask the companies that make them to go do testing and submit the results to them. And sometimes the companies just say, and because frankly the power divide is in their favor, and sometimes they just say, no, we're not going to do that testing, or hey, how about we just do this or that? And a lot of times they get away with it. And so you've got a regulator who just asks the company to test their own products. If they get test results they don't like, we've seen them either not deliver them at all or deliver them to the EPA with some ludicrous explanation. In the case of Roundup, there was an instance where they had a rodent cancer test come back pretty positive, and they said, we think this is because of the virus in the mouse colony, and that snowballed from there, where EPA was telling European regulatory agencies, yes, you can be set aside because of the virus in the mouse colony, and there would never been any virus, never any evidence of it. Monsanto just hoped that perhaps that might have explained why it looked like it caused cancer. So it's a pretty weak regulatory system we have here for chemicals in America, unfortunately. And you see EPA sort of bending over backwards to help chemical companies.
Right, and that's why what IARC did with glyphosate is so extraordinary. I think most Americans, if you'd ask, probably think that the EPA keeps off the streets, so to speak, dangerous chemicals, that's their job. But it's really the complete reverse of that. Actually, there's virtually no pre-clearing of a chemical to determine that it's safe before it's allowed into the marketplace. They may do things very differently in Europe and in other countries, but in our country, you can get, and there are thousands of chemicals that are out on the street, that are in the marketplace, that have never gone through any kind of truly independent testing or assessment to determine their safe use, right, or their potential adverse effect on human health.
At least with drugs, you have to do clinical trials. In the case of chemicals, and a lot of times that probably be unethical. So they say, well, this is going to be, you're going to wear protective equipment and stay away from this and spray it on this or that, or use it for chemical or a machine lubricant. So why would we feed it to humans? That's unethical to test it. And so what you get with chemicals is just lab testing on, in petri dishes or in lab animals. And what you're missing most of the time is long-term carcinogenicity testing, even of lab animals. And that's, of course, what you need to know with something that's suspected to cause a cancer is that's going to be a chronic effect, not an acute effect. So you need long-term studies with mammals to see if it causes cancer. Specifically with Roundup, one great sleight of hand that Monsanto has pulled and continues to pull is to say, look at glyphosate. We've tested it thoroughly. It doesn't cause cancer. The studies are split. It's pretty safe. And my response as a plaintiff's lawyer has always been, we are not suing over glyphosate exposure. Glyphosate is the main active ingredient that Monsanto discovered in the 70s. But Roundup is is a formula of ingredients. And importantly, it also includes surfactant, which is a class of chemicals that causes surface tension on droplets to decrease, and so things spread out over surfaces and stick and penetrate better. Think of soap. If you get water on your hand, it just forms little droplets all over. If you put soap, it forms a film on your hand. And these ingredients are not disclosed in the bottle, and they're often more toxic than the glyphosate itself. So that's been one thing that I was amazed to see over the years, and it's a long story and complicated, but how the chemical industry has steered the EPA into concerns of only with what the chemical companies deem the active ingredient. So what we've got going on all over the world and at these trials and everything is the sleight of hand where they say, look, glyphosate, there's these tests that say it doesn't cause cancer, and glyphosate's perfectly safe, blah, 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 glyphosate. And our response, which I'm never quite sure whether the jury's catch or not, although they've gotten it right every time so far, is no, it's Roundup. It's the formulation, and it's largely untested, and there's a reason that it's largely untested.
Well, I totally get what you're saying. It'd be like saying nicotine, which is the active ingredient in a cigarette. The science is inconclusive that nicotine causes cancer, but there are all these other things that are created when a cigarette is lighted, and all the different chemicals and components in cigarette smoke is together what we now know conclusively can cause lung cancer. So,
that's the best analogy I've heard, and if you don't mind, I'm going to start stealing it. That's exactly right. It's, they'd have you believe, well, this is, nicotine's not good for you, and frankly, it's probably not.
Right. It's addictive,
at glyphosate specifically as well as Roundup, which the EPA didn't do as much. And IARC found that glyphosate by itself is a carcinogen, which I firmly believe it is. But some of those studies reported like a 40% increased risk, which is nothing compared to, say, cigarettes and lung cancer. I think that once you add in this surfactant, which is often itself a carcinogen, and at the very least takes this carcinogen glyphosate and delivers it into living things' cells much more effectively, that increase in risk becomes enormous. But again, studies have simply not been done with the formulated products to the extent that they have with this purported active ingredient. They call the other ingredients inert. That was the great thing they pulled off with EPA. Of course, they're not inert as to human health at all. They're just so-called inert in the formulation because they're not the active herbicide. But that term of art has bought them a lot, and then EPA doesn't require them to test foods for residues of these other ingredients, which is crazy. I mean, that's another whole topic, because if you're not exposed to Roundup by spraying it or having your neighbor spray it, if you're eating a non-organic diet, you're probably ingesting Roundup 3 meals a day. It's used on 80% of row crops in America, and it comes to your table sometimes with a fresh coat of Roundup right before it's harvested.
All right. Well, so tell us a little bit of the story. I know it could be a very long story, but give us a bit of the story of the Johnson case itself. I mean, you're a young lawyer to be taking on one of the bigs of the bigs out there in what turns out to be the first major courtroom challenge to Monsanto over Roundup. Give us a little of the color of the trial itself.
Sure. So I filed a number of cases, most of which early on were in federal court because of diversity. And then sort of what I've developed as a specialty in my brief career is to keep things in state court, because what you'll get, the federal court is a multi-district litigation. It'll be big and often beneficial to one side or the other, to both, because it's sort of economies of scale and consistency of rulings. But it's always good to have some cases in state court that are proceeding independently. The companies will show up, they'll remove them to federal court anyway. They don't have to explain why, they just have to hit a button. We have to argue to get them remanded back down to the state court. But if you are clever about it, you can do that and get them going there. And then, they can show up to court and say, this is part of a much larger, thing. It needs to be delayed so it can go in lockstep with all these other ones across the country. But most state court judges will say, no, this is a widow here in this state suing you over the death of her husband. It's going to proceed, in a normal fashion. So I started working on that, and in Lee Johnson's case, he lives in the Bay Area of California, and right across the bay in San Francisco is a major distributor of Roundup. So they live in San Francisco, and so I sued them as well as Monsanto, and the case was remanded to state court in San Francisco. And it was just sort of proceeding in a normal fashion. And then one day before a status hearing that I was doing by telephone, I thought I'd better look at Lee Johnson's file and see if there's updated medical records, if there's anything to take notice of. And I started looking through them and realized that he was on the decline quick. His cancer had undergone what's called large cell transformation, sort of morphed into a different subtype of cancer, which was much more aggressive, and it had never been beaten into remission, and things looked pretty dire for him. So California has a statute that provides that if your physician thinks there's a substantial likelihood that you won't live beyond 6 months, you are entitled to seek trial before you die, and the court doesn't have any discretion there. There's other states that say, well, that should be a factor in considering setting trial, but California, they just have to do it if you can prove that. And I've used that in the past. So I spoke to Lee Johnson's oncologist, and she confirmed that and wrote a brief declaration saying, using the language from the statute, that she thought there was a good possibility he wouldn't be around in 6 months. And the court, sometimes that kind of motion is a little bit of a, please don't throw me in the briar patch, because you're saying, the statute actually, they have to set trial within 120 days of the motion, which is pretty quick, in our business.
Yes.
And
yes, it is. Any case. Yeah.
The judge will often say, and sort of did in this case, well, I don't know if either of you really want to trial less than 4 months from now. Why don't you talk amongst yourselves? But it was clear that, he was going to grant the motion. So we negotiated with Monsanto on a trial date about 10 months or so after that, in June of 2018, and that ended up being the first trial in the country.
So, and the specific cancer that IARC linked with Roundup in declaring it a probable human carcinogen, is that non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? It's
non-Hodgkin lymphoma. The Roundup seems to cause blood and lymph cancers specifically, which that is one. There's support for Hodgkin lymphoma as well. There's support for multiple myeloma. There's support for certain types of leukemia, all of which are closely related. But the strongest link so far in the studies has been to non-Hodgkin lymphoma.
Okay. So what kind of experts did you have to bring to the case? Because obviously the fact that IARC declares it a probable human carcinogen is a big help, but that in itself doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to make the scientific proofs that you need to make, right? You still have to bring in experts to prove not only that Roundup can cause, in this case, Mr. Johnson's cancer, but that he was exposed to enough Roundup to such that the Roundup caused his cancer specifically. Is that right?
Exactly, and those are two related topics that we call general causation and specific causation. So you have to prove general causation that this is something capable of causing cancer in humans, right? Because if it can't, then what are you doing there? And then you have to prove that this is actually what caused Mr. Johnson's cancer that he's suffering from today. So you start with hard scientists, toxicologists, and the like, who explain causation on a cellular level often, and explain to the animal studies. Then you have epidemiologists, who are often MDs, but not necessarily, who explain trends and studies of trends in populations. And that's how we detect cancer risk, because, as I said, it's unethical to do certain clinical trials. So you suspect something to cause cancer, you can't take a group of 100 college students and have 50 of them smoke cigarettes at a pack a day and see how quickly they get cancer. That's unethical. You can't get approval for a study like that. So for something you suspect causes cancer, you have to look at populations and compare people that are exposed, people that are not exposed, and see if you find an unexpected differential between the two populations in terms of cancer. So that makes up much of general causation. And then we have an oncologist, a cancer doctor who specializes in lymphoma and has looked up the studies, has looked up the medical records of the patient, often has spoken to him or met him in person, and sort of ruled in and ruled out the potential causes. And in this case, there's not a lot of known causes of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It's thought that that almost all causes are environmental, but we haven't identified exactly what chemicals cause it largely. Roundup is one of the exceptions. And so this doctor rules in things, rules out, and says, something like, I'm left with a list of one or a short list of things that could have contributed to this disease, and it's Roundup.
And the science from my own experience and understanding these cases too. I mean, the science really is the main obstacle to proving a case like this, right? I mean, they're going to come in, and I imagine they did come in to say, well, your science is not generally accepted, or point to other scientific studies that cast doubt on your scientific studies. How much of the trial became a battle over the science? Your experts against Monsanto's own experts, and how much of that?
It was a battle of the experts, and will continue to be at trials outside of the jury. It was a bigger battle. Monsanto was able to convince both the federal judge and the state judge in Lee Johnson's case to do a phased discovery and and allow them to challenge the science early on. They said, well, it wouldn't be worth, us going through all the rest of the stuff if they can't show that this causes cancer, which in the abstract sounds reasonable, but really prolonged and complicated the proceedings, because often it's hard to separate causation from liability. If you've got, executives saying, we're really concerned about this study, it seems to show it causes cancer. Is that causation science, or is that liability? So we had passed those tests with flying colors in both cases. The defense, the federal standard is called Daubert. It's called various things in different state courts. And courts have become, unfortunately, more activist on that front. In a lot of places, defendants have moved the battle line quite a bit successfully. And what the standard is supposed to do is say, is your science expert who's going to say that this causes this injury, this disease, is he relying on generally accepted methods of science, or has he designed a completely new experiment in his basement that nobody's ever tested that he's going to rely on? So it should be a pretty simple box to check. In this instance, there's a huge body of peer-reviewed scientific literature published in the medical journals and scientific journals to say that it causes cancer. There's some to the contrary, but certainly not enough for experts to, generally accepted to rely on peer-reviewed published medical literature. But we had to go through that rigmarole anyway, and to get to trial. But then, of course, it became a whole new battle at trial. They bring in their experts to cast doubt on the studies as well.
How much of at trial? How much of Monsanto's conduct as the maker and seller of this product? How much of that was part of what the jury was asked to consider in making their decision? Because obviously the science is a huge part of it, but you've talked about Monsanto being a really bad actor, and I'm wondering how much of their conduct was at issue in the trial.
Well, I'll tell you, we went into trial fairly quickly, and Monsanto thought they'd be able to delay it by sort of having this phase discovery where ostensibly not to get in much into the bad conduct until after we'd passed those hurdles. But, we used that state court statute to say, no, we're ready, let's just go. So we had, I think we had only seen the tip of the iceberg at that time. I still think that we've probably only seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of their behavior. But, what we had seen at that time was plenty egregious. Certainly, Monsanto knew for decades this was something that had at least a signal for causing cancer that needed to be explored. Maybe the most egregious. So, the jury looks at internal emails to Monsanto that nobody's ever seen before we get, civil discovery power in these cases. And the executives are being frank with each other or even using sort of code words. But, you see something very different than the public face they put on their products when they're discussing their concerns in-house. That, I think, was obviously a lot of it because the jury's awarded peanut damages in every single trial so far based on the conduct of Monsanto. One of the more egregious examples to me was in the 1990s or 99. Monsanto hired a genotoxicist in the UK. That's the study of cancer genesis, essentially. Some things might speed up cancer further along. Gene toxicity is does it cause the initial DNA damage to start the cancer process. And they'd hired one of the leading experts to look at what had been done so far and give them an opinion. And he came back and said, essentially, it appears to be genotoxic. And, you need to do, right away, you need to do this battery of other studies, X, Y, and Z. And they had all these internal emails that were like, does this guy work for industry before? Does he understand what it is we want? I think we need to discontinue this right away. There were no emails saying, oh, goodness, we need to get to the bottom of this. It was like, we need to bury this, and they never sent it to the EPA, and it never saw the light of day. So to me, just having those few things was plenty enough in our minds to win the trial. But I suspect that we keep going through documents on an ongoing basis, we'll find plenty more, bad acts.
Wait, so let me get this straight. So they hire an expert expecting, or I guess hoping, that expert's going to come back and tell them that Roundup is safe, and instead he comes back and says, no, this does damage the genetic material in cells, and you ought to do all these other studies. And in response to that, Monsanto, what? They just buried that and didn't do any further?
Buried it.
Oh my God!
I spent some time at several depositions going through the really into the weeds on EPA regulations, and there are a couple of regulations that make it absolutely clear that if they get an opinion, a report, anything like that, they've got to turn it over to EPA. And then they never did in this instance. They never gave it to any regulatory agency. It was clear, sort of reading between the lines, somebody was in the doghouse. Somebody was supposed to have groomed this scientist better, as the other scientists they hire are. With a wink that, we're expecting you to do well in this, doctor, and, fully expecting him to come back and reassure the safety of the product. And they're very surprised that this guy seemed to think that they wanted an honest assessment.
Well, and if anybody thinks that this is something that happens uniquely in the world of Roundup or Monsanto, I mean, it doesn't. I know, again, from the brain cancer cases I was involved with, the chemical involved was vinyl chloride, which is another known human carcinogen according to IARC. And if you look back at the history of the chemical companies that were making vinyl chloride, they hired an epidemiologist to look at vinyl chloride workers and try to figure out if there was a signal for cancer among the workers. The first group of
David Gerbrand.
What's that? Yeah, he was one of the ones involved. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they hired.
He's emblematic of that sort of science. He's at the University of Michigan, fantastic research university, as are many of these guys, and they've been carefully groomed, oftentimes since they're graduate students, by these big companies and wined and dined and given endowments. And by the time they're really at the top of their game and renown, they are well under the thumb of corporations, and it's known that these are the guys you go to if you want to get a safety blessing on your toxic chemical.
Well, I think that's one of the great features of a story like this, the case that you handled, which is, of course, as we pointed out earlier, we don't really have a regulatory system in this country where the government is funding any type of research or really forcing companies to do research on the safety of these chemicals. And of course, individuals don't have the means to, do any kind of real scientific due diligence on their own. So how does the truth come out? And, Roundup has been around for a lot of years with a lot of people using it for a long, long time. As you point out, it's probably, in every other mouthful of food we're ingesting at this point. Farmers, people who work on golf courses, people who are spraying weeds in their own backyard. It's so widely in circulation now, but now, and only now for the first time, is the truth coming out through the process of bringing a case like the case that you brought. And as you pointed out, because you kind of had to hurry up and get to trial in that first case, even more information is going to be coming out in the months ahead as some of these other cases get ready for trial. So where do you see this going, Tim? I mean, you mentioned you have something like 500 of these cases.
And that's a tiny percentage of the cases across the country.
Yeah.
I think there's at least 20,000 cases either filed or unfiled at this point. And the question for Bayer, which now owns Monsanto, is what do you do? What do you do when you have a company that's worth $50 billion, and that's a parent company there, and one of these cases is ostensibly worth $2 billion, and there's 20,000 cases. I don't know how or when it gets negotiated and settled. For now, we're going to keep going to trial because that's very effective. But obviously, we want to take care of all of our plaintiffs in the end. I would see there's every incentive for plaintiffs lawyers across the country to keep getting these cases to trial as often as possible and getting these big verdicts while we can. And they're all on appeal. I could see Monsanto hoping for. There's no Supreme Court law at the moment at all. There are some early challenges to preempt this type of action. Preemption is a very complicated sort of scheme at the federal level of what you can sue over, and this is clearly because of the 2005 Supreme Court decision not exempted, preempted, and the only real big sea change I could see is if Monsanto chased one of these verdicts all the way up to the Supreme Court and had them, change their stance on regulation of pesticides. Regardless, that's years away, and so I expect to keep seeing these verdicts unless the company can come up with a settlement that plaintiffs everywhere would accept. So, we'll see. I mean, from my position, I've been sort of shouting from the rooftops about what I already was getting into the weeds with you on the formulated product, because it is still very much happening. Monsanto's drawing people into a fight over glyphosate, and people are getting drawn into it. They're like, no, glyphosate causes cancer. And my message is, hey, don't take the bait on that. This is about Roundup, and Roundup is much more than just glyphosate. So in fact, we were able to figure out recently what is in the manufacturer of some of the surfactants that go into Roundup formulations, and there's different ones. On some of those surfactants, they actually put on the labeling, if you went and bought it from the manufacturer directly, this is known to cause cancer. This contains an ingredient known to cause cancer, and that ingredient is actually in group 1 of IARC. It's a known human carcinogen. But when that ingredient is bought by Monsanto and they put it in Roundup, they not only don't tell you that it's in there, they don't tell you that this product now can cause cancer. So we've actually just filed a lawsuit recently against both Monsanto and the manufacturer of the ingredient surfactant, which somehow loses the cancer warning between being made and being sold in Roundup. I've just been trying to direct everybody's attention to that there's more in it than just glyphosate. There's more carcinogens in it than just glyphosate. And, we need to take more of a 10,000-foot view than just arguing with Monsanto about glyphosate.
Well, let me ask you one last question about this, and because I think people listening to this and hearing you talk about this, I need to understand this. When I think people hear that a product causes cancer, they might think, well, it can cause all cancers, but of course, cancers are all very different in how they're caused and how they are how they're initiated and how they grow. Is it your understanding that at least right now science is telling us there's a link to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but not on any other cancers at this point? Or should people be concerned about Roundup use and other kinds of cancers as well?
Cancer's a spectrum, and certainly within blood and lymph cancers, it's definitely a closely related spectrum. And a lot of clients will get leukemia, it'll go away, and it'll come back as lymphoma, or vice versa. And that also within that range is multiple myeloma, there's Hodgkin lymphoma and other things. I firmly believe all of those can be caused by Roundup. What other cancers can be caused, I think we need to study more closely. But yeah, frankly, at this time, 2019, the mechanism of action of causing cancer for most things is still a big black box for all of us scientifically. Fortunately, in several cases, we don't have to prove mechanism of action. It's another fight that Monsanto and other companies will try to draw plaintiffs into. It's like, well, if this causes cancer, show us how. And, we sort of decline to try that because we don't have to prove how it causes cancer, just that it does. And, if we suggest to juries that we're trying to prove how and they don't buy it all, then they could come up with their own results. So, we're only just now figuring out how cigarette smoke causes lung cancer. A lot of things that we know that cause cancer, we don't know how they do or why they cause the particular subtypes they do, more than other subtypes. So there's some different theories, some of them over my head, but it's largely unknown at this time.
When is the next trial scheduled at this point, Tim? I
think there's one coming up this summer, perhaps in August, in St. Louis, which is Monsanto's hometown, and where thousands and thousands of cases are pending, and a lot of verdicts, big product verdicts that have come out of St. Louis in recent years. There are a lot of tort reform efforts underway there now, and I think the first trial it's gonna go in front of jury there in maybe August.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we'll definitely keep our eye on that. And I want to thank you, Tim Litzenburg, of Litzenberg Cancer Law. That's the name of your firm now in Richmond, Virginia. If people wanted to get a hold of you, or if they have if they think they might have a Roundup case and want to contact you, what's the best way for people to do that?
Yeah, that's actually a sort of a doing business as name. Our law firm is Kincheloe, Litzenburg and Pendleton. And for simplicity, it's klpjustice.com if anybody wants to get in touch.
klpjustice.com. Yep. Tim, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today and helping us understand the Roundup cases so much better. Thank you.
Well, thanks for your attention to this important topic.
Thanks so much.